Good afternoon. I'm Zenaida Quintana, the Chair and Acting Executive Director of Secular Coalition for Arizona and Secular Communities for Arizona. I want to welcome you and thank you all for joining us today to this edition of our web programs, which we handle every other week. We present these every other week at the same time through the links that you can reach through our website, secularaz.org. On that website also, there is a directory of the various presentations, the non-theistic and secular presentations that are scheduled for a couple of months in advance. In addition to our presentation today, I will shortly be introducing our speaker, but in addition to those presentations, we have HSGP is pulling rank on us. They have scheduled our speaker's boss for their presentation tomorrow. That presentation is at 10 a.m. HSGP, Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix, will be presenting a presentation by Nick Fish, who's the president of American Atheists. And that's part of their ongoing speaker series. They hold those twice a month at 10 o'clock on Sundays. And once again, you can either go to hsgp.org or secularaz.org. Secularaz.org, like I said, has a complete listing of all the presentations for secular and non-theistic interest. On the 27th of September, Or Adam Congregation for Humanistic Judaism will be having a presentation. The links, like I said, are at the websites that I mentioned. On October 2nd, Dr. Ron Fischler will present of the 6 choices we all have to end our lives. That sounds like a real uplifting presentation. It's presented by the Arizona End of Life Options Organization. Actually, that's an illuminating presentation. I've heard it before, and I encourage those of you that have not yet listened to it to certainly tune in on that one. And that one, by the way, is on at 1 p.m. on October 2nd. On October 7th, Dr. Dwight Moore will present on the same topic. Once again, you can get the link at the same place. On October 10th at 2 p.m., Katie Hobbs, Arizona Secretary of State, will be present at on this slot 2 weeks from now. She will fill us in on all the election issues. I'm sure they're very high on our level of interest at the moment, so I encourage you to look at that. On October 11th, the Tree Thought Arizona organization will present, this will be at 2 p.m. on October 11th, that's a Saturday, the Koch Influence Machine. I apologize, that's a Sunday, October 11th. The Koch Influence Machine, nationally and here in Tucson. They were talking specifically about the influence in Tucson. So those are some of the upcoming presentations that we urge you all to tune in on. And like I said, the links are available at secularaz.org. Without further ado, then, let me introduce our speaker today. We are fortunate to have Alison Gill, who is the Vice President of Legal and Policy Issues at the American Atheist. Alison manages American Atheist federal and state advocacy for religious equality and all the litigation activities to protect the separation of religion and government. She's a nationally recognized expert on civil rights law and state advocacy. Prior to her work with American Atheist, Alison worked as a consultant to nonprofits focusing on advocacy strategy and systemic change, and a senior legislative counsel at the Human Rights Commission, where she managed state-level advocacy on issues such as conversion, therapy, bullying, prevention, education, discrimination, health and wellness, as well as youth homelessness. Alison, you've had quite a history, so thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to our website. You have a presentation for us today, so if you would like to turn on your screen share, we'll let you proceed.
All right, thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be here and speak with you all. So I'm going to go into the presentation here. And I like to stop periodically and see if folks have questions. I'm going to be doing that. Does that look good? Yeah? Check. Okay, cool. All right, so today we're going to be talking about some really important research that we did last year and a new report that we published this year in May called Reality Check, Making Non-Religious People Count. And this research focuses on non-religious people, including atheists, agnostics, free thinkers, skeptics, etc., in the US, and looking at the community much more in depth than has been done before with a focus on that community. So let me get started here and talk about the agenda. First, we're going to be talking about what was the need for this research, and then we'll be talking about the actual survey and the new report that came out in May. We'll talk about what's coming next and do Q&A. Like I said before, I actually like to intersperse Q&A after different sections just to make sure no one has questions as we're following along. So if you do have any questions, just enter them into the chat, and I think that they're going to help me parse through them. All right, so let's first talk about data on non-religious people. So why did we feel the need to do this survey and write this report? Well, the fact of the matter is that there is a lack of data about non-religious communities, a significant lack of data. Federal surveys generally do not ask about religion in general. They don't ask about, not only do they not ask about non-religious people or atheists, they also don't ask about, other religious minorities or Christians. And in fact, there is a law that was passed in the 70s that prohibits the census from asking mandatory sorts of questions about religion. So prior to that, earlier in the century, for example, there were questions about religion that were asked, but after that point, there were not. So, and other sorts of federal surveys have basically followed along with that and not asked about these religious questions. However, federal surveys are the main source of where we get information about what our population looks like and where there are disparities. For example, we do education surveys like the Youth Risk Behavior Survey that the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, or BRFIS, which looks at older people and their health risks so we can understand disparities between different populations. These are really important for understanding the different demographics and what they look like so that we know, for example, based on an individual's race, what they're more likely to be at risk for, or their sex, how things vary based on these different demographics. And unfortunately, we don't have any data because of that on religion, not just for non-religious people, but for religious minorities as well. Even though that we know there are impacts, especially when it comes to, for example, education. So because we lack this data, non-religious people are basically invisible. We use data in our society to really move the conversation forward, to understand what are the risks that people are facing in their day-to-day lives, and to propose policy solutions and advocate to address them. So if we don't have any data about populations, then it's not an issue. Lawmakers don't think about it. They don't think, oh, we should address these issues, right? They just ignore the issue. Let me just see here. Well, actually, I started going into this already. Without data, non-religious people and the issues they face are invisible. We need them for understanding what exactly are the community needs, for advocacy, improving services, and getting and seeking grants and funding. So with regard to community needs, I think everyone has their own ideas about the community. Like they might think, for example, that young non-religious people face bullying in schools, or whatever it might be. People have their own anecdotes, right? But that's not the same thing as actually having data. And that's because everybody's experiences are different. And we don't actually know, we can make assumptions, but especially as non-religious people, a lot of us, we know this factually, claim to or really think that reason and science are very important things. And therefore we should be even more concerned about data about our populations. So it's not just what we assume to be true, it's what we have to study and know what we want, know what's true about our population. Also, advocacy is really important. That is really important for advocacy. It's one thing to go into a lawmaker's office and say, this issue is really important. It's, constitutional. You need to uphold the separation of religion and government. Please do this. It's another thing if you can talk about how it affects your population, how many people it's affecting, and how. that can be a really important factor for persuading people, both that it's something that they need to address and of its importance. So for advocacy purposes, data can be incredibly important. And then there's things like addressing services. Like, for example, let's say our research shows that young non-religious people are at significantly higher rates for bullying and harassment in schools. And here's a sneak preview, they are, particularly in very religious areas. Well, maybe then we as a community should be saying, well, anti-bullying programs should make sure to include this population because we know in different areas of the country, they are at heightened risk, right? So that's how we can improve services and programming based on the data that we're seeing. And lastly, seeking grants and funding. You know, as non-religious communities, generally, our national organizations get very, very, very little, and also our local organizations get very, very little foundation funding or government funding. And in part, that's because of a lack of data. I mean, funders don't just give money to organizations unless they can show that there's a need for that. And so having this data should be helpful down the line so that we can get the grants and money to keep organizations going and provide the services that will benefit our communities. So one example from earlier this year when it comes to advocacy was around faith-based services. So there were some proposed rules from the Trump administration earlier this year when it comes to faith-based services. I'm sorry, my cat is going crazy. When it comes to faith-based services, basically it's when the government gives federal money to, say, I don't know, a homeless shelter, right, to provide services. And very often they're giving them to religious organizations to provide those services. It's called faith-based services. Currently in the law, there are special requirements that these organizations must meet. They must, for example, inform the people accessing services that they have the right to not participate in religious services just to get, you know, whatever social benefit they're trying to get. Like, you shouldn't be forced to participate in Christian prayer in order to stay at a homeless shelter, right? So that's it's called a notice requirement, and that's currently in law. And there's also a referral requirement, right? So basically, if you don't want to get services there because it's a religious organization, they should refer you to somewhere else. That's secular. And the Trump administration is trying to cut both those requirements out of the current regulations. And so it's especially important for us to have data around this, because now that we have this data, we can say, well, not only is this bad, not only is it unconstitutional, but this actually affects our population in significant ways, which we can now demonstrate due to lack of data, due to the available data. For example, we know our population faces discrimination, especially in very religious areas, in these types of services. So it's even more important that we have this notice requirement and this referral requirement. So that's a really clear example of how we can use this data to back up what we're trying to achieve with regard to policy. So I want to make one really important distinction. There's a lot of talk right now about the growth of the non-religious community. And here we see some data from the Pew Research Center talking about what they call the nones, or religiously unaffiliated people. So on these large population surveys, these are the people that select sort of none of the above when it comes to their religious affiliation. So they're religiously unaffiliated. And that's grown to about 26% of the population. That was last year, so perhaps even more at this stage. I want to be very clear that that is different from non-religious people as you or I might think of them. Several of these groups of people, for example, are to at least some extent religious. According to the one poll in 2014, 34% of the nuns claim that religion is somewhat or very important in their life, and 61% said they believe in some sort of God or universal spirit. So it's not the same thing as being an atheist. It's a distinction. Now, as you see on the larger graph here, atheists and agnostics are a part of that larger 26%, but they're a smaller part. Together, we see they make up about 9% of the population. So that's more so the population that we're actually surveying here, not the larger 26%, the nuns, but the people that actively identify with one or more non-religious labels, such as atheist, agnostic, skeptic, freethinker, humanist. So any of those labels, as opposed to this larger category of people that are religiously unaffiliated, because that's That's very, very diverse, and it's not exactly what we're trying to survey. Many of those people are religious, frankly. And so with that, I just want to take any questions actually before I move into the actual meat of their survey and the report. Any questions so far? There are. I can't actually see them. I need you to read them to me, folks. Okay, well, not hearing any, I will just move on. Okay, so the US Secular Survey was a nationwide survey. It was conducted online from October through November 2019. We had originally expected and hoped to get about 10,000 people to take the survey, somewhere between 5 and 10. I was blown away and very pleased. When we first opened the survey, during the first 8 hours, we bypassed 10,000 people who took the survey. So we achieved basically 34,000 people, nearly 34,000 people all across the country that took the survey. And these are non-religious people. So people that actively identify as atheist, agnostic, freethinker, humanist, or skeptic, and not sort of this broader category of religious nuns. This is a convenience sample. The outreach was mostly online, and the survey outreach mostly occurred through our social media and also working with our partners. We worked with dozens of different organizations, both national organizations and local organizations, to help get the word out so people could participate. So here's a few breakdowns of what the sample looks like. There's quite a few more in the report itself, which I'll give you the site for in a second. But you can see here the age breakdown is a pretty good variation here. About 10% were 18 to 24, and the largest percentage were 35 to 44. You can see the gender differences here. There was quite a few more males who took the survey than females or TGNC folks. Although that is a fairly large percentage of TGNC folks. And one interesting fact, I think under 30, if you look at participants under 30, it's about triple that amount. So it's about 10%. So, and then you can see over here on the other side, the number of participants by state. In Arizona, there was a little bit over 1,000 participants. But we did have enough people in every state to have reportable data for that state, which is fantastic. That's our goal, right? We want to be able to make sure we have reportable data for every state. It's not too small a number for us to work with. And here is the report itself. It's available at secularsurvey.org. It's about 60 pages. It's a free report. So please check it out. It has a lot of interesting facts in there. I'm going to just touch the tip of the iceberg here and not go into everything else because there's a lot of charts. But I really recommend you check it out. I think you'll find it really interesting. So let's go in through, look at a few different aspects of this. First of all, one thing we get asked a lot about is identification with non-religious identities. So we asked people, participants, how much they identify with various non-religious labels. And you can see here, the top two that got the most people identifying with were non-religious and atheist. And if you look at somewhat, atheist was the highest with about 95% identifying somewhat or very much as an atheist. And the others, secular and non-religious, were also quite high. We also asked folks which is their primary non-religious label. And again, atheist was about 57% here, followed by humanist at about 14%, and the other ones were smaller. Now you might be thinking, Allison, you work for American Atheists, and weren't the people you surveyed, of course, your members? Well, no, that's not the case. We actually, this was a much broader survey than just American Atheist members, especially because we worked with a lot of partner organizations to get it out. I think we asked about membership in national organizations, and I think about 10% were American Atheist members. So it was not predominantly American Atheist members, and I think the largest percentage were actually FFRF members. So I just want to preempt that question because we do get asked that. We also asked about concealment. So that we were looking at basically how often people conceal their non-religious identity or beliefs in various aspects of their lives. And here, you can see the responses ranging from never to always. and in different situations, like with people at school, people at work, etc. And by looking at this and basically taking a mean across the different categories, we're able to arrive at what's called a scale. So by having a scale in this way, we're able to basically assess whether concealment changes based on different factors. Like, for example, if there's a lot more stigma or discrimination where you live, is there a higher rate of concealment? Or is it different for different subgroups of non-religious people? So that's why it's useful to have these sorts of questions, because then we can measure how does concealment vary across different circumstances. But you can see here it's very interesting. There's a high level of concealment in different situations. And this also varies quite a lot by age. I'm working on the youth report right now, and it's significantly higher, for example, among family when it comes to youth. So I don't have that data here, but you'll see it soon. The highest rate of always concealment was among people at school. And if you look at it, it's a little bit over 40% mostly or always conceal their non-religious identity at school, which is quite high. We also asked people about discrimination or negative events based on their non-religious beliefs within the past 3 years in different areas of their lives. So you can see people said that there was quite a few negative events about, based on their non-religious identity when it came to social media and family. Those two aren't frankly discrimination, they're just tracking negative events. But when it comes to areas like the military and education and employment, we did see quite a few negative events. About 1 in 5 people said there was some discrimination in employment based on their identities, about 1/3 in education, and about half when it came to the military. And those are all quite striking. I'm gonna show you a little bit more in a few minutes on this, but these also vary quite heavily based on the type of area a person lives in. Like if it's a more religious area, these numbers are much higher, and in less religious areas, they are much, much less so. We also looked at stigma. So these are incidents. The way you measure stigma is by looking at incidents that don't rise to the level of discrimination, but that are sort of an omnipresent minor events that show sort of the outsider status or how non-religious beliefs are disfavored in the broader population. So things that happen that to sort of convey the message that what you believe or who you are is not acceptable. Like, for example, here, I've been asked to go along with religious traditions to avoid stirring up trouble. Others have treated me like I don't understand the difference between right and wrong. These are things that, non-religious people frequently report happen to them because of their non-religious beliefs. And so by measuring these, again, we were able to arrive at a scale to look at how stigma varies in different areas and circumstances. I should mention that the top item, I've been bothered by religious symbols or text in public places, that was not part of the scale. We sort of asked that separately, and it doesn't quite fit the same sort of scale system. But regardless, it was quite interesting. And you can see the level of stigma. It falls at about seldom, sometimes somewhere between seldom and sometimes. So in the middle for most of these sort of issue areas. We also tested for likely depression and for loneliness, and for the participants. So we asked 3 different questions about loneliness and social isolation, and we also asked 2 questions that are normally used for screening when it comes to check for depression. So basically, a person answers these questions, and if they indicate further screening, then they take additional screenings or tests if they were like being actually tested for depression. So this initial sort of 2-question allows us to assess if there's likely depression or depression is indicated. And so by looking at these, we were able to assess, okay, what is the psychological impact for the things that we are seeing? The level of depression, the level of discrimination, the level of stigmatization, is that having an impact on our participants? So if, for example, if there's more discrimination or more stigmatization, does that have an effect? And here we did see that discrimination or negative events, higher stigma, and greater concealment were all correlated with increased loneliness and likely depression. So the higher levels of discrimination, stigma, and also greater concealment of their non-religious identities, had higher levels of loneliness and likely depression. There's better charts for that in the actual report. I'll show you in a few minutes some charts on that issue, but there's really good charts in the report that can sort of break that down. One thing that's particularly relevant to young people, we asked about family rejection. So we asked whether basically how supportive their families were of their identities, of their non-religious identities. And this chart is only for basically people whose families are aware of their non-religious identities. So like I said, there's a lot of concealment, especially among youth, with regard to their families. So if they're aware of their non-religious identity, what is the response like? And we see that it's nearly 40% were somewhat or very unsupportive. So it's quite a high level of, oh, there we go, 37%, my picture was covering it up. About 37% were somewhat or very unsupportive. So more than a third, which is a fairly high rate of family rejection. And we found it had a significant impact when it came to educational attainment. People that had a high level of family rejection were less likely to get higher education, especially to go to college and to get, like, for example, advanced degrees. And also they were significant, I think, had a 72% more likely to be depressed than people that had less family rejection. I think the most striking difference that we saw was the difference between very religious and not at all religious communities. So we saw all these numbers I've been talking about were significantly worse in very religious communities as opposed to not very religious communities, especially discrimination and stigma. So what does it mean, very religious versus not very religious community first? Well, we asked people, what is your community like? How religious is the community in which you live? And you can see about a third of people said that their community was very religious in the survey. And maybe about 25% said it was not at all religious or a little bit religious, so about a quarter. And the rest of the people were somewhere in the middle. And so we looked at the states and we sort of broke them into 4 quartiles based on the percentage of very religious people that say their communities are very religious. And you can see on the right here, Arizona's somewhere in the middle. I'll talk about the exact stats for Arizona in a few minutes. But other states like Utah, Idaho, and especially in the Southeast had a high level of people saying their communities were very religious, which is kind of what you'd expect, but it's good to see the data actually correspond to what you'd think. So those communities, you can see how the community religiosity breakdown worked. So we compared the percentage of participants saying current community is very religious against the level of stigmatization. And you can see a really clear pattern on the left here, that in states where there's a higher percentage of participants saying the community is very religious, we also see significantly more stigmatization and those negative events we were talking about earlier. This is especially true for Mississippi and Utah. They were at one end of the spectrum. And in the other end are states in mostly in New England where they're not particularly religious. You can see Arizona's pretty much right in the middle here, next to Illinois and Pennsylvania. So it's sort of moderate in that respect. So like I said, here's some Arizona specific data. We had about 1,000 participants take the survey from Arizona. As far as percentage of participants in very religious communities, it was about nearly 20%. So 1 in 5 said that their communities were very religious, which placed it in the 3rd quartile. So it wasn't in one of the top 2 very religious states, it was in the 3rd ranking of states. Concealment. So how often do people sort of conceal their non-religious identity? It was about slightly less than the mean. So they're less likely to conceal than the average non-religious person in the survey. And they're more likely to disclose their identity than the average in the survey. And these are slight differences there. So just a little bit, they're mostly near the average. And the stigma was also, there's slightly less stigma for non-religious people, according to the participants in Arizona compared to the survey mean. It's almost on the mean though, it's very close. I think this was probably the most important chart for the survey that I found. So this is basically looking at what discrimination looks like in people that say their communities are not at all religious or a little bit religious versus very religious. And you can see in areas like education, it's about 2.5 times higher in very religious areas. So education discrimination based on non-religious beliefs or identity is about 2.5 times higher for participants in very religious communities versus not at all or a little bit religious communities. And again, in public services and employment, and even in private businesses, it's significantly higher. Employment was quite a difference. It was about 3 times higher. People are more likely to face employment discrimination based on their non-religious beliefs. So you can see the differences here. It's quite marked. And we also looked at different subpopulations and the data that the differences we saw there. I should mention that we are actually in the middle of producing subpopulation specific briefs as well. So we're going to be putting out briefs about each of these different groups. We found that Black participants were about half as likely to have supportive parents and about 3 times as likely to be physically assaulted as the rest of the average participants. Ex-Muslims were about twice as likely to experience negative interactions with police and court systems. Among non-religious service members and veterans, about half had negative experiences during their service. And young people were about 5 times as likely to be physically assaulted and 3 times as likely to be depressed as the rest of the participants. And so I'm actually working on the brief for young people right now and going much further into detail on these and other stats related to that subpopulation. But this is just a sort of a preview to give you some idea about differences between populations of non-religious people. We also asked participants about their policy priorities. So what policy issues are most important to them? We asked them to choose their basically top 3. And interestingly, we found that the one that people chose by far most often was maintaining secular public schools, which had about 51.9% of people say that was their biggest one of their top 3 priorities, followed by opposing religious exemptions that allow for discrimination and access to abortion and contraception. So there's a stereotype about non-religious people that all we care about is opposing religious displays on public property and how, that's such a big issue. It's funny because, we added that to see how much people were concerned about that. And it was actually at the bottom of the list. It was about 13% said that was one of their top 3 policy priorities. And I forgot to mention this. This is policy priorities that the participants wanted secular organizations to work on. So this is aimed at, what are the policy priorities that you as secular organizations should work on? There was another chart in the report about what are your general policy priorities and how important are they to you. So this one is aimed at specifically organizations like American Atheists and local organizations like you all. So I thought that was really interesting. And you can see there's, quite a lot of support for things that maybe aren't even typically considered. Like, for example, I was surprised by the level of support for protecting the environment and addressing climate change, which is really interesting. It was about 35%. So more than a third of people said that was one of their top 3 priorities. We also looked at voting. And there's another stereotype about non-religious people that we do not vote. Well, I can tell you that at least the surveyed population, that is not the case. We found that about 95% of people said they were registered to vote, and about 87% said they voted in 2016, which is very, very high. If you look at now this is not directly comparable, but if you look at the voting rate for the general population in 2016, it was about 55.7%. So this is significantly higher. Now this is self-reporting, but it is also anonymous, so people really don't have a reason to lie to us. But still, it's quite high. There's been some research on religiously unaffiliated people in voting, so the so-called nuns I was talking about earlier. And that group has, been shown to have a slightly lower voting rate than the average population. But like I said before, we're not studying the larger group of nuns. We're studying the smaller group of people that are non-religious, so non-religious people. And so it's really interesting the differences here. You can see sort of the confusion, the masking of data that occurs when you group in non-religious people into this larger category of people that actually have very different beliefs and values than the larger category of people. So I thought that was quite interesting. You can also see on the right, we sort of group states by the percentage of people in those states that voted. Arizona did very well. I think you were in a second quartile, so somewhere between 84 and 87% of people who took the survey said that they voted in Arizona, which is the second most high after the top group, states like Colorado. Great. And lastly, we asked about local group engagement. So how often people participate in activities with local groups and how often they're involved with local groups. Well, first of all, we found that about 22% of people who took the survey said they were involved with a local group, which is fantastic. It shows a really high level of involvement with local organizations and community building, which is really terrific. We also asked what percentage of people participated in or were interested in participating in different types of activities, such as social opportunities, educational opportunities, volunteering, or advocacy. And you can see the rates here. Most people have participated in social or debates, but not as much in advocacy, although there was a high degree of interest in both advocacy and volunteering. But by far, there was the most interest in further resources for people with children. And I hear that a lot when I speak with groups, that people would want to participate more, but they have difficulty finding ways to involve their children. So I thought that was really interesting as well. I'm getting just a little bit of feedback. There we go. We also, and this is a separate chart, just to be clear, we asked, we did a comparison for people that are involved in either membership in a national organization or a local organization, or have participated in one or more of these activities to look at the impact on how that affects your psychological outcomes. And so we found that people that were more involved in these activities actually were less likely to be depressed. So they had less likely depression, significantly less. Like we found that membership in a national organization was associated with basically a third less likely depression, and almost the same amount for at least one secular activity, and about a quarter less for being a local group member. So I think that shows that being part of a community is an important protective factor, and also to combat some of the loneliness, stigma, and discrimination that we were talking about earlier. So that was really interesting. Now that I'm thinking about it, I'd like to see how that varies between more religious and less religious areas, but that's not something we've looked at yet. But that's the great thing about this data. We'll have it for years. We can always do more research on it. And with that, I would love, actually, let's take questions on this before I go into what's coming next. So I would love any questions.
Okay, there is one question from one viewer, Alison. Myra asks, have you looked at the effect of gender, the differences for men and women in families, employment, etc.?
That's a great question. So we did a preliminary review based on gender. And I should say, we helped develop this survey based on a series of focus groups that we did at our conference in Cincinnati back in 2019. And we actually did different focus groups. Like we did some that were, for example, single gender to see if there were differences. We actually found there were quite significant differences when we were doing the focus groups for all women versus for mixed groups or for men, which was interesting. So we thought we'd see maybe some differences based on that with regard to sex and gender. We did not see anything at first glance that was very significant for me to report it. However, one of the things we're considering is making that one of the future breakout briefs that I mentioned earlier, to do like a deeper dive and see what we can tease out that's more interesting. So there was nothing so marked that it caught our eye during the first go through, the first check. And I should mention, I'm not doing this. We have researchers that do this sort of work. I'm a lawyer, but we hired a fantastic research firm out of New York that developed the survey and does the analysis. I'm great at talking about it, but it's the researchers who are good at actually doing it. But we did this first round, and there was not something so marked that I can highlight it for you. Hopefully, we'll be able to do that breakout brief, and I'll be able to give you more data in the future.
Okay, those are the questions we have for now, Alison. Let me just remind our viewers to please, you can go to the chat or on Facebook and ask your questions for Alison while we have her. Alison, you have a closing, I take it.
Yes, I have a few more. Okay, so I mentioned this before, but we are working to create briefs based on different subpopulations. The first one is going to be non-religious young people, and we're also working on one on Black non-religious people. So that will probably be, the non-religious young people one should be out before the end of the year, and the Black non-religious people brief should be out hopefully at the beginning of next year. We're also going to be doing additional webinars about advocacy and community outreach and how to better use this data for different purposes. And we're working with a research archive to sort of host the data so that we can make it available to partner organizations and to researchers to do more analysis on. So that's underway. It's taking some time for them to do the data checking, but it is in process. So that's sort of the next steps for what we're hoping to do with this research. I should also mention that the research, we have an action alert that's available on the website, secularsurvey.org/act, so that allows you to send the report to your lawmakers, to your local and national lawmakers, to make them aware of it and about the differences in demographics and outcomes. We also ask people to help us raise awareness. And lastly, this is entirely funded by our donors and the broader community. It's not like we, for example, I mentioned the problem before with getting grants for research. So, if you like this work and want to support it, that is the link for doing so on the secularsurvey.org donation page. And with that, I'd love to take any other questions folks might have.
There is one that has been sent in by Sammy, Alison. Okay. And the is there research on the statistical population of LGBTQ plus people in relation to the secular non-religious community? If so, is the number statistically significant? I guess that's the difference between LGBTQ and the other communities.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. So the non-religious community is significantly larger than the LGBTQ community, if that's what you're...
I believe it relates to the proportion of LGBTQ in the non-religious communities as opposed to the...
Oh, okay, all right. So this is not a population survey. So I cannot answer questions about this many people exist in the country or these are differences in population size. I can tell you though that about 1/4 or 25% of people that took this survey of the 34,000 was LGBTQ. That does not mean that 1/4 of non-religious people are LGBTQ. There has been some great research by, I think, PRI that says that about somewhere between 40 and 50% of LGBTQ people are non-religious, which was interesting. So that exists, but I don't have, I can't provide you exact data on percentages of the non-religious population and how many of them are LGBTQ. I can just say that in our survey, it was about 25%, which is very, very significant. I mean, it was still, almost 10,000 people, which is pretty great.
Thank you, Alison. I have one other question while we're waiting for other people to post their questions. As you know, the big topic on social justice of the day are the topics around the Black Lives Matter movement, the issues associated with white privilege and the historic discrimination that populations of color and in particularly Black populations in the U.S. have suffered. One of the problems, of course, with organizations like AA or Secular Coalition for Arizona or other non-theistic organizations, particularly vis-a-vis our supporters, is identifying and articulating the intersections between those causes that most of us, I think, recognize, those injustices that we recognize, and of course, the issues associated with non-theistic or secular activism. Have you done any research on that, or can you illuminate us on where you see the overlap on these two issues?
Absolutely. I think that there is actually quite a lot of overlap, but in some areas, I think it's not explored to the extent that we as a community should explore it for the very reasons that you're talking about. I would point to, for example, when it comes to prisons, for example, we know that a lot of prison-focused programs are very religious, and they sort of target and maybe even try to indoctrinate. There's benefits to prisoners for being, being associated with different religious groups or religious programs in prisons. So that is sort of unfairly preying on different people. So that can have an impact, based on, that might have an impact based on religious belief and also race. Another area when it comes to policing. For example, we know that there are efforts by white nationalists to infiltrate, well-documented efforts by white nationalists to infiltrate both police agencies and also, sheriff agencies across the country, and a lot of other extremists. But we also, there's growing evidence that there's an effort by Christian nationalists to do the same. And there's, of course, a lot of overlap between those two groups. So I think, we speak about the activities of Christian nationalists all the time, particularly when it comes to things like Project Blitz. And I think that there is a space for us to be able to talk about how these people are trying to not only interfere in other areas of the law, but also becoming engaged in policing in a way that's disadvantageous to people of other religious beliefs, and also different races. So I feel like there's a lot of space there that we can develop. I don't think it's fully fleshed out in a way that I'm ready to sort of advocate on it. I think we need to do more research and work, frankly, and something that I've been investigating quite a lot to figure out how we can play an important role there. Another thing that just comes to light, even in this report, I spoke earlier about the differences between subpopulations. Well, we found that ex-Muslims, for example, were significantly more likely than other non-religious people to face discrimination when it came to police and court systems. And there might be other types of, disparities between populations as well. But I mean, that shows that gives us additional reason to sort of focus on those types of areas, because we know segments of our population are having very high disparities there. So I think there's lots of other things we could explore like that. Those are just a few examples.
Thank you. Thank you for that response. I think it helps point us in a direction. One of the things that I wanted to mention is historically, marginalized population, and certainly Black Americans, have essentially drawn support from communities of faith. They have essentially sought help and mutual support in faith-based initiatives and faith-based organizations. Does AA work with faith-based organizations in pursuing secular policies, say at the legislative level or litigative issues?
We absolutely do. So we're in, I don't know, many coalitions at the national level. It's hard to even estimate a number. We're involved with many different coalitions on the national level, focusing on different issue areas. For example, civil rights, reproductive justice, things like LGBT equality. They're different areas. And many of those groups are, for example, religious groups. We're involved with the Interfaith Alliance, for example, and the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, and many other groups that we have sort of, we agree on ends. So we agree on, for example, working to make sure that people have access to abortion and other reproductive services. Well, we have a lot of partners in that, and many of those groups are religious. So, it's not like we refuse to work with religious groups. We look for opportunities to partner wherever we can with groups across different, perspectives and spectrums.
We have a question from Andrea. She asks, has there been research done on the infiltration of Christian nationalists into the military? Are you aware of any, Alison?
The military itself, I'm not the person to go to for that. I think I've read some work on that, but I think that there are groups that focus on that a little bit more. Like, for example, Jason Torpy's group and Mike Weinstein's group, who focus on those issues. and if I could remember the name of the groups, I would say that. The military, free thought, I don't know, maybe you folks can help me type it in the chat. But there are several groups that focus on those issues. And I would look at those more so than I can tell you. I mean, there's a few stats we have here about people's experiences, but it does not talk about infiltration. However, the research that has been done has shown, the military has been getting more religious over time. And so I think it is a serious concern. It's just not one that I can authoritatively talk about.
Yeah, there's a post now on the chat. The website for that disappeared. Anyway, Military Association of Atheists and Freethinkers is one, and there's another one that was up a minute ago. That's the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, Mike Weinstein's group. Okay, so there are indeed some other groups that, as you say, who specialized on deep diving into military issues, and particularly in defense of people like us that in the military that are discriminated against for non-religious beliefs.
And they're fantastic. They do really great work. Like I said, we have a few stats in here that I hope are helpful, but I mean, they definitely are the experts.
They are indeed. While we're waiting for a couple more questions to come in, let me just mention, I mentioned that Nick Fish is going to be on tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the HSGP presentations. You can get there, like I said, from hsgp.org, look at that link, or secularaz.org also has that link, along with the links of all the other secular groups. That topic is going to be, it'll be on a completely different topic than Alison's. And I can promise you that it will not be as quantitative or fact-filled as the one we've just listened to. He is going to be talking about a very timely topic. What now? Fight for our rights outside the courts. So obviously, particularly with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the court issues are going to take front stage. They're going to be able to divert from some of the other scandals in the administration. But clearly, the court is going to present, I think, an even more imposing obstacle for us. Would you like to talk specifically about inside the courts, since Nick will be focusing on outside the courts tomorrow, Alison?
Sure, I'll touch on it. So yeah, I mean, it's been a challenging situation in the court for quite a while. I mean, we had significant losses this year in three cases, including Little Sisters of the Poor case, especially the Espinoza case, and the Guadalupe case. So I won't go into a lot of detail unless folks want me to, but it's been a rough time in the courts for several years. And this is not going to do anything to help the situation. I will say, though, that our side, defending the separation of religion and government, was already significantly losing at the Supreme Court level. But with another person that Trump appoints, I think there will be, basically 6 people on the court that don't really believe in the concept of separationism. They're more of what we call judicial accommodationists, who believe more in the idea that as long as there's no coercion, then everything is fine, which is pretty antithetical to what a lot of non-religious people believe in, that there should be a wall of separation between religion and government, and that, for example, the government should not be funding religious organizations. So, the courts have been challenging for a while, and I think it's why it's so important for us to be able to effectively focus on advocacy at the state level and at the federal level. And that's one of the reasons why we did this research, so that we have the tools to be able to do that type of advocacy work. And it's also why we published, for example, the report we put out every year, the State of the Secular States, which looks at the laws and policies in every state that affect the separation of religion and government, because that's an important advocacy tool that folks on the ground, you all, can go into Arizona and be like, this is what we need to change here. So that's really our goal. I mean, of course, we do court work as well, but I really feel like advocacy is where we can make the biggest difference right now, with the courts being in such a challenging place.
Thank you.
We have a hand up in the audience. It looks like someone calling from Tucson. I'm going to unmute you if you would like to ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear? Okay. Yes, I'd like to advocate for outreach to the disabled, the blind, the deaf, wheelchair users, brain damaged people, and people with mental illness. Because every time I am told to get help, the only volunteers are ultra-religious, uber-religious, or church religious places. There's really no non-religious.
That's really important. And frankly, you know, I think that we learn something every time you do a major survey like this. And if I could do it again, I think I would specifically ask about disability issues, because it's not the first time I've heard that question. And I can't give specific stats for that population, the population of people that have disability issues, but I think it's really important, and you raised some really good points. One thing about the survey that I didn't mention was that we asked at the end two open-ended questions about, discrimination people face and their experiences of coming to terms with their identity and telling other people, basically. And we received just a large number of stories of people that encountered issues, related to their disability, and how, it was difficult for them to get services. And so I think it's something that we really do need to do a better job of addressing. And so it's sort of got some ability to capture it in the report, because we did look at things like discrimination when it came to, for example, mental health services and things like substance use and other types of health services. And we saw, discrimination levels in those areas, but doesn't clearly differentiate between like the general population and people that have specific disability issues. So, but thank you for bringing that up. I think it's a really important reminder.
If I may add to that briefly, Alison, I believe that may have been Helen Wheels who asked that question from Tucson. Let me mention that the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix has very specifically a group that is focused on providing aid and comfort to members of the Humanist Society and other affiliated people with HSGP in times of need. And if you go to the website, you can connect up with them, hsgp.org. And it's run by Vici Duarte, and she's done a fantastic job of connecting with people in need and providing various services. We're trying to get a similar program started through Free Thought Arizona in Tucson, and we've not got that off the ground, but I hope we do shortly. There's one more question, by the way, that just came in, and we're almost out of time, but I did want to address that. You've kind of sliced and diced your data in many great ways, Alison. One of the questions involves, did you do this in particularly the family discrimination issues with regard to religious affiliation, for example, Mormons or Jewish in particular? The viewer was asking about, is there less of this in the Jewish community, which has more of display tolerance towards non-belief as opposed to the more militant or evangelical denominations?
So the answer is we did not. I don't think the researchers looked at that particular aspect, which is, I think you're asking basically, is there different levels of family rejection in different faith traditions? Like, for example, if a person was raised in a Jewish faith tradition versus a Christian or Muslim or whatever it might be. And so I don't think we looked at that specifically. We did look at strictness of religious upbringing, and we also looked at strictness by various different populations. And so there is also some degree where there's more people that had a more strict religious upbringing also had a higher level of family rejection. So that is available, and it's in there. And in the youth report, we also did some analysis of family rejection and how the religiosity of the community people live in, which is also really interesting. We found that there's significantly more, and this is not in the report yet, you'll see in the youth report, there's significantly more family rejection in areas that are very religious, which might make sense, but it's not something we had considered. And I think it's particularly important, because it means those young people both have more family rejection, and there's less access to resources available in the community that might be able to help them. So I think that's a really important finding.
Thank you so much, Alison. Unfortunately, we have reached the terminus of our available time. I do want to remind our viewers about Nick Fish's presentation tomorrow at 10 o'clock. hsgp.org or secularaz.org to get the link. And also, I want to remind people of the secularsurvey.org, where Alison's information is available. Continued for us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was wonderful to speak with you all.
Thank you, Allison.
That's really great. Thanks. That was fun.